Welcome back to Brain Chatter, where we listen past the daily noise and explore topics at the intersection of leadership, workplace culture, profit, and sustainability. I'm your host, Derek Brown. Today's topic is critical mistakes to avoid if you serve on a board of directors, for-profit or nonprofit. What we will discuss applies to a small private company, a hunting club, a chamber of commerce, a youth sports league, an industry association, a homeowners association, a church, a temple, a foundation, the list goes on. And it even applies to serving on the board of directors of a large corporation, such as a Walmart or a Nucor Steel or a Tractor Supply. It can be any organization that has a board of directors and elects you to serve on that board. Serving on such a board comes with many opportunities to provide leadership and to do your civic duty and making a positive difference if done well, but it comes with some liabilities that we should be vigilant to guard against. Today's guest has lots of unique insights into this topic. Laura Gregory practiced law for over 30 years and has served on a number of different boards and recently joined Ken Chapman & Associates Incorporated, my employer and the sponsor of this podcast. She is bringing her years of experience to the table in her new career as a management consultant for the benefit of our clients and today for the benefit of anyone listening to this podcast. Laura, thank you for your time and welcome to Brain Chatter.
I'm so excited for the opportunity. I really enjoy listening to your podcast and appreciate you including me. It's great to have a conversation about serving on boards of directors specifically. So often we jump at the chance to serve and we get so excited to help that we forget to ask some difficult questions. So hopefully as we walk through today's discussion, we'll encourage people to maybe step back and thoughtfully consider what it means to serve on a board. It's a big commitment and it's an important role to an organization.
Laura, let's start with a basic first question. In just a few sentences, will you define what a board of directors does?
First, I'd like to make sure we all have a general understanding of the term board of directors. The board of directors is a group of people created in the bylaws of a corporation, and that's true of a nonprofit or a for-profit. And once those board members have served their initial term, they're either elected by the shareholders going forward or they're appointed by the members of a nonprofit group. The bylaws define the number of directors and their roles. So the board of directors is really an entity unto itself whose qualifications are established by the bylaws of the corporation. As a board is formed and works with the shareholders or the members, they set the tone for the organization. They kind of steer that ship. They do the strategic planning for the corporation, whether it be for profit or nonprofit.
Let's say someone from a board of directors reaches out to someone and they're discussing the possibility of this person being elected to a board of directors of whatever it may be, the local youth sports league or a small or large company. What are the top questions the person should ask as they consider saying yes, but before they say yes?
Derek, the first question I always tell people to ask if they're considering serving on a board is, why do you want me? What role can I fill that no one else can fill? And what are your expectations for me? Especially on a nonprofit board, a board member is expected in many cases to either raise money, to make contributions themselves. So it's a real commitment, not only of time, but sometimes of resources. And once I know what they're looking for, then I can make a decision about whether or not I'm willing to commit my time, my resources to that group. When you ask me to serve, am I going to be mediating between unhappy board members? Are you looking for free legal advice? You need to know going in what's expected. So to me, that's the very first question you ask is, what role do you want me to play? You're going to be committing, and I know you know that we all have limited resources. As professionals, we all have to think long and hard about what we want to do with our volunteer time. So I'll always tell people to ask yourself, is this something that's going to help you meet your goals for serving in the community or professionally? It's an honor, but it requires an investment of time and it can expose you to certain liabilities. It's important to ask, is this something so important to me that I'm willing to put my time in and my name and reputation?
Talk a little bit more about how important is it to know the reputation of the organization who is making this ask of you? And how do you discover that reputation?
Derek, that's critical. I'm so glad you asked about that because once you're on the board of directors for a corporation, whether it's for profit or nonprofit, your name is tied to that group. You're going to be on their social media. And you need to make sure before you join that you've looked through their financial records, that you've made sure that there's no mismanagement, that there's no employee lawsuit on the horizon, that they have been conducting business in a professional way. It's also important, in my opinion, that any board you serve on provide directors and officers insurance because that is just critical. If there is an issue further down the line, you don't want to be paying legal fees to protect another organization because you're on their board. So, those are great questions that should be asked before you agree to serve on the board.
Okay, let's say that as I'm considering serving on this board, whatever type of board it may be, I want to know if I say yes and if I'm elected, how can I measure whether or not I'm contributing to the board in a successful way? How do I even know what those metrics are?
That's huge, Derek, because you want to meet expectations. I always say you have to consider this in a different manner if it's a for profit or a nonprofit. It's much easier with a nonprofit because most nonprofits are going to say, as a board member, we expect you to raise this much money. We expect you to contribute this much. We expect you to provide introductions to members in the community. We expect you to attend fundraisers, speak at civic groups. They'll have a pretty detailed list, and you just check the boxes on those. With a for profit, it really does make a difference what size the company is. A large corporation, you may just meet their expectations by showing up. They basically are going to pay to use your name and reputation in the community. With a medium to small for profit companies, that depends on what they specifically are looking for. If they have an accountant on the board, they may be looking for something specific, and they'll tell you that right up front. Ideally, when you're serving on a board of a small or medium company, you're going to be there to help them plan their future so that you can work towards a goal. With really small boards, you may be a shareholder or an employee, and that means you may be expected to help hire a CEO or set salary for upper level management. So it all depends on the size and type of board. But here again, if you will have asked that hard question at the very beginning, what are you looking for? What do I need to commit to? Set some expectations for me. If going in you've had those expectations set, it's a lot easier. But one thing for sure, if the organization is not doing well, if the organization is floundering, then you know you're not doing your job. And you need to sit back, evaluate, and decide how you can help move this organization forward.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Let's talk a little bit more about nonprofit boards first, and then we can move on to for profit boards. One of the beautiful things about the culture of the United States that goes back to the very beginning is what Frenchman Alex de Tocqueville observed in 1831 while he was traveling across the very young U.S. It is a place where people feel more empowered and more incentivized to start entities that solve problems from the ground up than in most other countries, even most other industrialized countries. A part of that is that Americans volunteer with and start nonprofits that address local and national issues at rates higher than other developed countries. That means that there are lots of boards that need qualified leaders to support our complex ground up civic infrastructure, whether that be the local school booster organization, conservation groups that build trails, historical groups that preserve local historical places, organizations to address local hunger, or local Rotary Lions or Exchange clubs, and the list goes on, of course. Generally, we are discussing business topics on this podcast. What I've just outlined indicates how such nonprofits make the places we live better. Will you talk about how serving on a board of a nonprofit might impact someone's business or career, and what are the incentives to serve?
Well, first off, serving on a nonprofit board is a great way to give back to the community. It's a great way to network. It's a great way to educate people about who you are and what you do. You know, Derek, you and I both have owned small businesses before that required us to sell our services. And one one of the best ways I found to let people in the community know who I was and what I did was on these nonprofit boards. They're awesome for networking. It's a great way to not only give back to the community, but to make those connections with, like minded folks who are going to be maybe of help to you in your career. It's a great way to kill two birds with one stone. You're working to make where you live a better place, but you're also working to help your career.
Could you talk a little bit more about what it was like for you to serve on some of those nonprofit boards that you've served on in the past? What did those organizations do, and what were the top lessons that you took away from that service that you provided to those boards?
Well, Derek, the very most important thing that I got out of it was the ability to help people. That's huge. Just being able to give back to the community is awesome. Two boards come to mind when you ask me that question, and one is the Community Foundation of West Alabama, and one is Eagles Wings. The Community Foundation of West Alabama is just what it says. It's a foundation that helps the community, just like the Birmingham Community Foundation works with lots of different groups. The Community Foundation of West Alabama was formed to really try and be a conduit for folks who wanted to help in the local community but weren't really sure how to do it. We set up donor advised funds. It really made it easier for local folks to keep their money locally and make a difference. The Eagles Wings board was very different in that it was set up for a very specific purpose of providing day habilitation and residential services for adults with developmental disabilities. I saw a parent who saw a need just become so passionate about that, somehow meeting that need, that it grew into a large, successful organization that now has residential homes and rehab facilities for a lot of folks. So to me, it was just so fulfilling to watch a dream in both cases, whether it was the Community Foundation of West Alabama or Eagles Wings, a dream to make our community a better place. Just that passion and that commitment and that hard work. Literally, it went from an idea, a spark, to a very successful organization. And that was so fulfilling for me. And I felt like I had really helped accomplish something. And from a professional standpoint, met folks on those boards that I still am in contact with and who we work together on a lot of other projects. I'm not serving on either board now, but I still keep in touch. And it's very fulfilling to see how successful they've become.
There is a rather sobering old adage, and I tried to find the citation for this, and it appears that it's not clear who said it first, but the Frenchman Charles de Gaulle apparently used it quite often. The adage is, the cemetery is filled with irreplaceable people. Sometimes one person simply cannot or does not want to get their mind around the fact that one day things will go on without them. It's true for every one of us. I've seen this firsthand on nonprofit boards, and in particular on one local credit union board, where sometimes a small clique will run an organization into the ground over the years or decades because nobody ever rotates off the board and few new ideas are brought onto the board. And that creates a lot of blind spots and leaves the organization outdated. How can an organization guard against this?
Wow, Derek, you have hit on one of the most common reasons that boards are not as successful as they can be because they don't evaluate their board members. We all accept a role when we come onto a board, and it's up to the board and the CEO or the executive director to constantly be evaluating each board member and making sure that they are still necessary, that they're still adding to the organization because a board that's not continually changing isn't going to be as successful, is not going to grow, it's not going to be as productive. You're just going to get that stagnation, not just for the board, but for the organization. And, in worst cases, it can ultimately result in the failure of the mission of the organization. So I always think it's critical that boards evaluate themselves constantly. One thing that solves this real quickly is term limits. The most successful boards have term limits, and they also don't let the person who's rolling off appoint their successor. You really do need a nominating committee who is going to sit down and identify the gaps in the board, who's going to set goals for new board members, who's going to nominate qualified individuals to serve. This really keeps that one person from controlling new appointments and from even though they've resigned from the board, they're still got a lot of control and a lot of input into what happens. Additionally, you need a strong chairman that's going to rotate positions and is not locked into that position. That's just critical for continued success. You've got to make sure that all your board members are necessary. And if they're not, replace them with someone who is, because that board is responsible for steering your ship. They're the strategy planners. And if it's not fresh, and if they don't have a good perspective, and if you're not bringing in folks who can put a new eye on where you are and where you need to go, you're going to do like any other organization. You're going to become stagnant. And we all know that that is not a good place to be.
Great insights. Now let's turn our attention to for-profit corporate boards. A person might be elected to sit on a for-profit corporate board if they are an owner. It may be because they bought a piece of the company, or perhaps they inherited it, or a company may ask a non-owner to sit on the board because they feel that person's expertise is important to their board. In either case, this for-profit corporate board member may or may not be compensated with pay or stock or otherwise. From a legal standpoint, is there any additional likely liability for being a paid board member versus being a uncompensated board member?
Wow, Derek, here again. Don't know if you know what you've asked, but this is critical here. Um, Board members are not always paid. That's true. And the majority of board members are not paid if they're a shareholder or an employee of the company. It's just something they do. Everyone serving on a board should understand that they incur personal liability for breach of their duty while serving on a board. There's no distinction between a paid or active versus non-active board member. The liability is there. And it's critical that when you start considering whether or not you want to serve, that you make sure you understand your liability. Um, you are a fiduciary and you're held to a fiduciary standard, and that means that you owe a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, all these legal duties. And I'd like to go down a list if we have time to make sure you understand, wow, I'm putting not only my reputation on the line, but I could be putting my assets at risk if I serve on a board and don't do my job.
That's very important, so let's definitely get to that. Before we do that, let me pause and do an introduction of you for those who are listening. Laura Gregory joined Ken Chapman and Associates in 2022 following a successful career as an attorney. Laura's practice focused primarily on representing business owners and developing estate plans. Laura is a graduate of the University of Alabama School of Law. She is a member of the Alabama State Bar and the Florida Bar. Laura is a past president of the Tuscaloosa Estate Planning Council and the Exchange Club of Tuscaloosa. As we mentioned, she has served on numerous nonprofit boards, including Kentuck, Eagles Wings, and the Community Foundation of West Alabama. She resides in Tuscaloosa County, Alabama, with her husband Patrick, and she has 3 children, 1 grandson, and 1 granddaughter. In her free time, she enjoys reading, baking, and gardening with her family. Laura, did I miss anything that you'd like to add?
No, Derek, you hit the high spots, and I really am not as old as that makes me sound, but thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, you started law school at age 5, isn't that correct?
That's correct. That's
Yes, that's what I thought.
correct.
Well, let's go ahead and move on to the topic where we kind of left off. And I'll ask a different question. Is it accurate that all companies with an Inc. at the end, is an abbreviation for incorporation, are required by law to have boards of directors, but companies formed as a limited liability corporation, the LLCs, are not required to have boards of directors? Did I oversimplify that, and is that even correct?
Well, Derek, corporations are governed by state statutes when it comes to formation and their governance. And so every state is different. So I'm speaking here with regards to the state of Alabama, not federal. So federally, really the federal government stays out of corporate governance and creation and is really only concerned about the taxation part. So, yes, if it has an Inc. in its name, it's going to be a corporation and it's going to be managed by a board of directors with the caveat that a closed corporation or a small corporation that elects to be a closed corporation is not. It is governed by its shareholders. That is not have anything to do with taxation. It's not like the difference between a C corp and an S corp. It has nothing to do with the taxation. Just how a entity, an organization is governed internally. Now, with regards to limited liability companies, those are not corporations. They're companies that's very similar to a partnership. So, a limited liability company is going to be governed by its members, a partnership by its partners, and those entities require or by law have a lot less rules to follow. It doesn't require board meetings and shareholder meetings and minutes and those type things. And often that can be why a an accountant or an attorney will recommend a limited liability company over a corporation. They all have the same legal limited liability as far as being sued, but they have very different governance requirements and tax laws.
And Laura, of course, we're not offering any of this as legal advice. Obviously, these can be very complicated topics. If someone is listening and does have more questions about any of this, is it correct that they can go to their state bar association's website and find a listing of attorneys that they could consult with on any of these topics?
Sure, and that's exactly what they need to do. I'm speaking in vague generalities here and just trying to make folks who listen to the podcast aware of the fact that they just should not arbitrarily say yes to serving on a board, that it comes with real responsibilities and liabilities, and these are some of the things they need to consider.
Absolutely. Well, let's bounce over to a related topic, not to be confused with actual boards of directors or another thing called advisory boards. Would you mind fleshing out what the difference between these two are?
Not at all. And this kind of gets us back to that liability issue. Advisory boards are groups that are not authorized to act for or make binding decisions on behalf of the organization. They have no fiduciary duty or responsibility. They're strictly there to give their opinion and move on. And really, advisory boards are a great way to get people involved in nonprofits and for profits who really don't want to make the commitment or take on the liability of serving on the board of directors. A lot of nonprofits will use advisory boards to bring in members of the communities they serve to get their input and their position and just become more effective in the community. Another way that for profits use advisory boards is if you've got someone who you would really like to have on your board, but they don't have the time or want to make that commitment, you can get them in an advisory role and still take advantage of the knowledge and experience that they have. That's the biggest distinction, I would say, is the liability issue.
Laura, at a few different points, you've mentioned the liability component, which of course shows up big on any of our radar if we're thinking about it. Could you talk more about liability that comes potentially with serving on boards?
Wow, Derek, you just hit the nail on the head as far as making a decision as to whether or not you do or do not want to serve on a board, that liability. And I mentioned the term fiduciary a moment ago. You need to understand that as a member on the board of directors, you are acting in a fiduciary role. What that means is you owe a duty. You owe a duty to the shareholders, to the corporation, to the stakeholders. You are taking on that legal obligation. Fiduciary means that there's a special relationship between the parties where the duty that I owe to the parties is over and above just what I owe everybody walking down the street every day. It is the highest standard of duty implied by law and based on that special relationship of trust and confidence between the board, the shareholders, and the employees. It's really something to consider because when you sit in that chair on the board of directors, you're taking on the obligation to make sure you are working in the best interest of someone other than yourself. Again, all the information I'm giving today is not in any way in my role as an attorney, but rather as a team member with Ken Chapman and Associates. But I'm going to geek out for a second and say my favorite statute that defines what a director has to do is this statute in Minnesota that lays it out very clearly that says a director shall discharge the duties of the position of director in good faith in a manner the director reasonably believes to be in the best interest of the organization and with the care an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances. I know that it pretty geeky, pretty lawyer. Every state it's different, but every state is going to impose a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, a duty of obedience, a duty of confidentiality, a duty of oversight, good faith, business judgment, all of those things. And just real quickly, Derek, if you don't mind, let me give a one sentence definition to each one of those so that folks will understand what we're talking about when we talk about these duties of care.
Yes, please.
A duty of care is a fiduciary duty requiring directors and or officers to make decisions that pursue the corporation's interests with reasonable diligence and prudence. And diligence is something we need to focus there because that means if I'm sitting on a board, I can't just let the accountant come in or the comptroller come in and say, hey, we've got more money in the bank than we had last time we met. Or we paid everybody's salary this month. We're good to go. No, I've got to actually take on some responsibility in making sure those words are backed up by the actual numbers. You've got to be diligent and prudent in how you pursue your role. You've got to use care. The duty of loyalty. You've got to act in the best interest of the members and owners and avoid a conflict of interest. If I, as just an average citizen, find out about a piece of property for sale, let's say, and I want to buy it, but I also know that the company that I'm sitting on the board of directors also wants to buy it. Well, I can't put my interest above that corporation's. I owe a duty of loyalty to that company, to that organization. So you have to work really hard to avoid conflict of interest. And most boards will have a conflict of interest questionnaire they'll have you fill out and turn in every year to make sure those conflicts are avoided. Duty of obedience. You've got to act in compliance with the laws, the regulations, the charters, the bylaws. You can't just ignore the rules that have been set out. So if the bylaws require a vote of the shareholders, you got to have a vote of the shareholders. If the bylaws require that you have 7 of 8 board members for a quorum rather than just a majority or 3/4, that's how you have to act. That's how you have to operate. Duty of confidentiality. Can't talk about what happens in a board meeting outside of the board meeting. Loose lips sink ships kind of thing. And there's a duty of oversight. You've got to proactively ensure that you have all the full and necessary information before you take a vote. So you can have a committee make a recommendation, but you've got to make sure that you know that you have all the information you need to make a good decision. That's just critical. And good faith, you've got to make decisions that are financially, ethically, and legally sound. A director must, and I'm just screaming this. If I had a typewriter or if I was texting, this would be in all caps. Must obtain and review relevant information, raise matters of concern. Just make sure that everything you do is in the best interest of the company. That's always going to be the standard. As you serve on that board, if you've been in business, you know that one reason they want you on the board is for your business judgment. You just got to put everything else aside and make sure the decisions are made in good faith upon reasonable investigation and honest belief that it's in the company's best interest. This is by no means an all-inclusive list, but I know everyone's probably asleep now, but these are things you really need to go back and make a list of and make sure that if you're on a board that you're doing all these things. Everybody has seen in the media where companies are starting to be held responsible for their actions. All the pharmaceutical companies that have run into issues with the opioid crisis, it can be really dangerous to be on a board because even though some of those owners and shareholders have, paid a fine, there are a lot of people who want to really hold not just the board accountable, but the individual serving on the board with not just financial penalties, but criminal penalties. So it's important that you make sure as a board member you're asking the right questions. You're digging until you get the information you want. You're responsible for what happens. I won't name the board, but there is a board that I'm aware of locally where, the executive director, I don't know how to put this more kindly than just said, hey, was stealing them blind. And everybody looked at that board and said, how did you not know? How did you not see this? And to be honest, they had a hard time answering that question. At the very beginning, I talked about making sure that you know that a board or organization that you're about to serve with, that they've got good financial records, that they're filing all their tax returns, that they're audited, because nobody's going to listen to the part where you say, that all happened before I got on the board. Nobody gets to that part. They just get a list of the current board of directors, and that's who they want to look at.
These are all great insights. And of course, the title of this podcast is Critical Mistakes to Avoid If You Serve on the Board of Directors of a For-Profit or Nonprofit. Let's dig a little bit deeper into that. You have, I believe, created a list of some of those top critical mistakes to avoid. Is this a good time for us to go through that list?
Sure, this is perfect. The first thing, and this kind of loops back into what I've said earlier, stop before you start. If you're not passionate about this organization, if you're not committed to its success, don't serve on the board. Define your role before you say yes. Failure to realize that this is a job and to decide how much time you're willing to commit. That's huge. You gotta figure these things out. Don't stay too long. That's a big mistake folks make. Don't overcommit to the board. It just makes it harder for everybody. Don't become an advocate for a certain position and stick with it no matter what the board decides. Once you are on that board, you're part of a team, and just always remember that. Failure to maintain confidentiality. I've seen folks serve on a board so they could get the inside scoop, and that's deadly. And we just went over this, so I hope everybody has a list of things to recognize as far as the legal requirements for serving on a board. People just don't pay attention to that.
Laura, even though you just made a list of critical mistakes to avoid if you serve on a board of directors, for profit or nonprofit, some of those things you just listed could easily also be on a list of how to live your life well.
It's so funny how if we would just set some basic standards, some basic rules for ourselves and pretty much apply them everywhere, we'd probably be a lot better off.
I'm going to relist one at a time each of the things that you just listed and ask you to just tell us a little bit more about each one. Well, your first one was stop before you start if you are not passionate about the organization.
If you aren't willing to sacrifice for the group, just step away. Don't get started. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's going to take a financial commitment at some point. Just don't agree if you're not passionate about it. Find a group that you are passionate about and work with them, but don't shortchange a board because you lose interest or it's not something you're really interested in.
Your number 2 was failure to define your role.
There is nothing more frustrating than sitting on a board and not having a good idea of why you're sitting there. It's so frustrating because you really want to be useful. And Derek, I know you and I've talked about this before, but one of the reasons that nonprofits like the Exchange Club or other civic groups can't keep younger members is because they don't know why they're there. Board members will quit showing up for board meetings, for fundraisers, for anything if you don't tell them why they're there and if they don't feel like they really are contributing.
Makes a lot of sense. Next on your list is failure to realize this is a job.
Agreeing to serve on a board is an agreement to show up, to provide input, to support the mission, to define the mission. And these are all things that take time. And if you're not willing to invest your time, don't accept the position because it truly is a job. And once you agree to serve on a board of directors, you're agreeing to do those things at the very least. Show up, provide input, and support the mission.
Which leads to your next point, which is failure to ask questions.
If you're on a board, you've got to ask questions. You've got to ask the difficult questions. If you're there as a member of the community, you want to know why they're spending money on project A instead of project B. Well, part of the reason you're there is to help the board decide which project to decide. So you've got to question decisions and you've got to ask for information. If you're not sure that the numbers are working out, well, ask to see more. Don't just accept things that are presented. Part of your job as a member of that board of directors is to provide insight. The knowledge that your experience has brought you puts you in a unique position to do that. We're all becoming more and more familiar with the expression, silence is consent. If I'm sitting on that board of directors and I just get that feeling in my stomach that, this isn't sitting well, then if I don't speak up, then I've consented to whatever happens.
We've seen that recently for sure. Staying too long was the next one on your list.
There are a lot of reasons to stay on a board. Continuity, the experience that's there, and in some nonprofits, it's sad to say, I can't find anybody to take my place. There are a lot of reasons, but staying on a board too long can have you and the board wishing you had never served. Offer as much as you can and achieve things, but don't overstay your ability to contribute. If you're not contributing, then you need to move on. Leave while you're on top is always a good suggestion. And my goal is to always be the board member that people go, gosh, what could we have done if she had stayed another term? Rather than the one people go, whew, I sure wish she had left last year. So that's part of making that good decision.
Next on your list is overcommitting.
We all have been in those board meetings or in a lot of meetings where everybody's assigning duties and you go, I can do that. Yeah, I can do that. I can do that. And a friend of mine and I, we used to have this joke. She would say, why did you commit to doing that? And I would go, well, I thought I'd be dead before I had to do it kind of things. Don't commit to things that you cannot get done. Make sure if you commit to do something, you'll do it. Even if you're a volunteer, what you do or don't do on that board affects a lot of people. And it's not just the board, it's not just the board meeting, it's an organization that is depending on you to make a contribution and to be a resource. So don't overcommit. Do what you say you're going to do.
Next on your list was taking sides or becoming an advocate for a certain position, no matter the consequences to the board.
And Derek, you were so insightful when you said these are just good rules for life. But specifically with a board, offer your input, Offer it strongly. Once the board makes a decision, get behind it. And now this, of course, is not if it's something illegal or financially inappropriate, but if it's a decision about the direction or personnel, then you got to accept the board's decision and move on. You can't go back to a group or to the media or anyone and say, this is what they decided, but I think we should have done this or I think we should have done that. It's your duty to add to the health and sustainability of the organization as a whole. Don't get drawn into the drama. Support the organization. That's your duty.
Absolutely. I believe the last thing on your list, failure to maintain confidentiality. That's when you mentioned earlier about not becoming part of the problem by sharing too much outside the board.
Exactly. If you are not the spokesperson for the board, then your only response should be no comment. Whether it's your mother in law or MSNBC, your response is no comment because you just do not have the information or the ability to speak for the board. Unless the board appoints you as that person, then your job is to say no comment. And it's like you said, here again, I find that if I had said no comment to folks in my family, 99 times out of 100, I would have been so much better off. So just don't talk about the board, don't talk about other board members, and most especially don't talk about what happens at a board meeting. It's a job with a duty and liability. And take the steps to protect yourself and your reputation from serving on a less than stellar board.
So we've covered the list of mistakes to avoid while serving on boards. Let's talk about what it looks like to be a good board member. Would you provide some insights on what that looks like?
That is critical. A good board member is going to attend every meeting that they can. That's going to be a priority, attending those meetings, because remember, a board has to have a quorum in order to take any action. So attendance is important. Make sure you read everything. A good board member is going to read everything and show up at the board meeting prepared to ask questions, prepared to take a vote. So being prepared is important. The main reason you're on the board is to share your knowledge and expertise. Share it, contribute. Make sure that you offer an opinion. If you have an opinion that is going to contribute to the discussion, share it. You're there to share. Provide that knowledge, provide that expertise. That's critical. A good board member is going to learn about the organization and commit to the mission of the organization. You are going to make sure that you know what the organization is doing and what it wants to achieve. And that way you can actually help them do those things. Find out about the organization and show an interest and let people see your passion. Let people see that you personally are committed to the success of this organization. That's critical. And then all board members should have to take an oath to stay out of the day-to-day decision making of the organization. Unless it is literally your job, don't get involved. Let the CEO, let the executive director, let the president, let the officers, let the people who are paid to do it run the organization. Keep a big picture focus. Don't try and get into the day-to-day decision making of the organization. It's not your job. That's not why you're there. So just stay in your wheelhouse. I think if you can do that, you'll be a member that every board wants.
Great advice. Thank you very much for fleshing that out. And that leads directly to one of my last questions, which is, would you talk about where the lines are drawn between what a board of directors does and what a CEO, a president, an executive does? Is this always in writing or just a general understanding when it comes to organizations?
As any good lawyer, I'm going to tell you everything should always be in writing, Derek. But no, unfortunately, a lot of the time it's not. But just to give you brief understanding, a brief outline, let's start with the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer. The Chief Executive Officer is going to make the organizational decisions that are key to steering the company's strategic direction, focusing on improvement of the operations, the resource management, and the culture. They're responsible for the day to day operations. The CEO is going to vary depending on the size of the organization. And so the larger the organization, the less they're going to be in that day to day operating. But for small to medium sized organizations, the CEO, whether that be someone that's literally called the CEO or the president, maybe just executive officer, they're going to be responsible for those day-to-day operations. They're kind of the in the trenches leading the troops. Now the board of directors, they're elected by the shareholders to represent them in the decision-making process. They are responsible for strategic planning, corporate oversight, just management of the policies, such as declaring maybe a stock dividend, outlining stock options, that kind of thing. That's what the board does. They make those long term strategic planning decisions. Well, and additionally, the board is normally responsible for either hiring the CEO or electing the president, and maybe even setting compensation for upper level management. But CEO, that president, they're the person who's going to run it day to day. And the board of directors is just going to be more of watchdog, making sure that their goals are being implemented. And remember, too, CEO is going to be there every day, all day. Board of directors is going to meet once a quarter, once every 6 months, sometimes only once a year. It's really the CEO who is in charge of the day to day operations, and the board of directors is going to set goals, establish a mission statement. They're going to be the big picture guys.
And of course, you and I have both seen organizations, nonprofit and for profit, I can think of both, where board members or the board chairman in particular got really involved in day-to-day activities way beyond the bounds of where they should have been. And it was just the launch pad for dysfunction, destruction, and turnover. The best people left the organization. And I can think of one for-profit organization that it really chipped away very quickly at them as it happened. They could not keep the best people.
Well, the best people aren't going to stay where there's a lot of conflict. And when you have a person, and I've unfortunately even seen just members of the board of directors try and go behind the CEO or president's back and rehire people or fire people or change duties, and you just can't have that. And that's why you lose the good people, because people only want one boss or one leader. You can't have two heads of one organization. It's got to have one head. In properly run organizations, it's going to be your chief executive officer. And that's why he's called chief, or she is called chief executive officer. They're the chief. They're the ones who's going to make the decisions. And here again, just like serving on a board, once a decision's made, you got to get behind it. The same thing is true. Once everybody commits to the CEO, then you got to let her do her job. You can't be stirring the pot.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you taking the time to flesh all of this out. It is very important. Is there anything that you can think of that we should close out this episode with? Maybe a question that I did not ask you, but I should have, or something else that you'd like to add?
Well, I don't want to leave people with the impression that they shouldn't serve on boards. Yes, serve on boards, get active, serve in the community. Just ask some questions before you do it, and look for a well-run board. Look for a board that has people who attend the meetings, who aren't always on the board, who do that strategic planning. Serve on the board. Just choose the board you serve on. Don't let the board necessarily choose you. You choose the board. I guess that would be the biggest thing, because I don't want to leave people with the impression that it's not worth it, because it very much is worth it. If you can feel like you've contributed in some small way to the success of an organization that is making a difference in the community, whether it's a nonprofit helping feed people or help people have a place to stay, or a for profit that's providing jobs and paying taxes, you've contributed to the success of your community, and it is well worth it.
Well said. Thank you so very much, Laura. And we'll provide links to resources mentioned in this episode at brainchatterpodcast.com. I'll also link to your bio, Laura, and your LinkedIn account in case folks would like to connect with you or follow you on LinkedIn.
Thank you, Derek.
You're very welcome. Brain Chatter is a production of Ken Chapman and Associates Incorporated. We assist clients across North America and beyond with leadership development, corporate culture transformation initiatives, behavior-based professional development for health and safety issues, individual and team assessments, conflict and performance management, succession planning, and team building, making a difference in organizations and individuals' lives for over 40 years. Learn more at leaderscode.com. Please consider ranking and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. The more reviews or rankings we receive, the more the algorithms recommend us to new listeners. For a weekly leadership quote, follow Ken Chapman and Associates Inc. on Facebook or LinkedIn, or The Leaders Code on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you for your valuable time.